On the morning of December 16th, 944, in the German town of Monschau, the frozen ground shuddered as American artillery shells whistled overhead. But this was no ordinary barrage, for something was terribly and fundamentally different. The shells were not hitting the earth or the dense trees. Instead, they were exploding in the air, directly above the German soldiers as they advanced, creating a storm of steel that no foxhole could defend against. Men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, many of them hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, were facing a form of attack that defied all their combat experience. They were accustomed to the familiar patterns of artillery, knowing where to find cover from predictable ground impacts and understanding the safety offered by trenches. But this was different. This was a precise, calculated death delivered from the sky. At that very moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group was making a monumental decision against direct orders. Because his position was being overwhelmed, he ordered his men to use shells armed with the Allies' most guarded secret, the proximity fuse. These devices used miniature radar to sense their altitude, therefore detonating at the perfect height to shower shrapnel downwards. This innovation was set to increase the lethality of artillery by an incredible 50 times, rewriting the very calculus of combat in the forests of the Ardennes. The German soldiers could not have known it, but they were the first to experience a weapon so advanced it would change not only the outcome of this battle, but the future of warfare itself. Operation Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, had started with great optimism for the German army. It was Hitler's final, massive gamble, committing 200,000 soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces to a surprise attack through the foggy Ardennes forest. He had promised his generals this offensive would break the Allied lines and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, therefore turning the tide of a war that Germany was steadily losing. Because of the thick fog and dense forest, the initial attack at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th was a complete but tactical surprise, with German cannons firing 600 rounds per minute along an 85-mile front. American intelligence had completely missed the scenes of this massive military buildup. Therefore, many of the frontline units were either inexperienced new arrivals or battle-weary veterans sent to what was considered a quiet part of the front for rest. But at Monschau, Colonel Axelson was in an impossible position. His unit, the 38th Cavalry Squadron, was a small reconnaissance force being swamped by a much larger German assault. His conventional artillery was not enough to stop them, because his men faced certain defeat. Axelson made the unauthorized and historic decision to deploy the secret proximity-fused shells. The impact was instant and overwhelming. German soldiers, advancing in their standard formations, were suddenly caught in a type of artillery fire unlike anything they had ever seen. The shells burst 30 to 50 feet above their heads. Each explosion created a downward cone of deadly fragments that covered a much wider area than shells that exploded on the ground. Seasoned veterans who knew exactly how to survive a normal artillery barrage were now exposed and helpless in their foxholes, behind trees, and in ditches. The proximity fuse was a triumph of American science and industry working together. Standard artillery shells needed to hit their target directly or use timed fuses that were often inaccurate. But the proximity fuse was different, because it contained a tiny, self-powered radar system about the size of a soup can. Inside this small device, engineers had managed to fit 130 electronic parts, including tiny vacuum tubes built to survive the crushing 20,000 times force of gravity from being fired out of a cannon. The science behind it was remarkable. When the shell was fired, the intense acceleration broke a small glass vial of electrolyte, which instantly created a battery to power the radar for the shell's short flight. This entire project was led by Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory with an intensity that rivaled the Manhattan Project. The lab was secretly located in a former used car dealership in Maryland, and at its peak employed 3% of all physicists in America. Security was incredibly tight, just like the atomic bomb program. Workers were forbidden from discussing their work, even with their own families, and every single fuse was given a unique serial number for tracking. The technical problems had at first seemed impossible to solve. The delicate vacuum tubes used in home radios had to be completely re-engineered to withstand being shot from a cannon. They needed to operate while spinning at incredible speeds, function in any kind of weather, and be sensitive enough to detect the ground without exploding too early. The solution came from new miniaturization techniques, with a team led by Dr. James Van Allen, creating vacuum tubes no bigger than a pencil eraser. By December 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. The program involved over 100 companies, including giants like RCA and General Electric, and its total cost was $1 billion in 1940s currency, a sum equivalent to over $17 billion today. Axelson's decision on December 16th caused a crisis in the American command. He had broken a strict rule that limited the use of proximity fuses to anti-aircraft guns over the ocean, where a dud shell could not be recovered and reverse-engineered by the enemy. But the weapon's incredible success at Monschau could not be ignored. The German assault had been completely stopped, with casualty numbers that stunned both sides. News of this new weapon's power traveled quickly up the chain of command, because the situation across the Ardennes was becoming increasingly desperate. General Eisenhower formally requested permission to use the fuses in ground combat on December 19th. By December 21st, the restrictions were lifted, and proximity-fused shells were approved for use across the entire battlefield. The speed at which these shells were then distributed showed the strength of American logistics. Within days, artillery units throughout the Ardennes were receiving the new ammunition. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion in Bastogne got their shipment just as the town was surrounded. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion began using them to defend the roads into the town, and the 969th Artillery Battalion, a segregated African-American unit, used them with devastating results to the southwest. Every unit came to the same conclusion. The proximity fuse turned artillery from a supporting weapon into a battle-winning force. The siege of Bastogne was the ultimate test for the proximity fuse in a defensive battle. The 101st Airborne Division was completely cut off and outnumbered, but they held the critical crossroads against constant German attacks. Their defense was supported by the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and its 75mm pack howitzers, which could fire proximity-fused shells. Between December 19th and 31, the 463rd fired over 600 rounds. Because supplies were limited, not all of them had proximity fuses, but those that did had a profound impact. German attack formations seemed to simply vanish under the air-bursting shells, with entire platoons wiped out in an instant. The German attack on December 22nd, launched after General McAuliffe's famous nuts, reply to the surrender demand, perfectly demonstrated the weapon's power. German infantry were caught in the open as they crossed snow-covered fields. The proximity-fused shells exploded above them with perfect timing, creating overlapping zones of destruction with no place to hide. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion was also essential. Their larger 155mm howitzers created a deadly ring around Bastogne that the Germans could not break through. Because these larger shells exploded 50 feet in the air, they covered an even wider area with shrapnel, German prisoners would later say that their units would lose all order before even reaching the American lines, as soldiers broke and ran from the terrifying airbursts. One of the most well-documented examples of the proximity fuse's power happened at the Sour River on Christmas Day. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was fighting its way north to relieve the soldiers in Bastogne, saw it himself. A German battalion was trying to cross the icy river at night, thinking the darkness and fog would hide them. Standard artillery would have struggled to hit them. But proximity-fused shells did not need to see their target. Patton later wrote about the event in his memoirs. He described how the shells burst in the air directly above the German soldiers, who were trapped with the river at their backs and American fire all around them. When it was over, a count of the bodies revealed that 702 German soldiers had been killed. This was a chillingly effective demonstration of the weapon's power. An entire battalion had been destroyed in a matter of minutes, without any chance to fight back or escape. The psychological effect was immense, as other German units in the area began refusing orders to make similar river crossings. The thick forests of the Ardennes, which the Germans relied on for cover, became deadly traps with the introduction of the proximity fuse. In an open field, an air-bursting shell was dangerous enough, but in a forest, its effects were amplified. The explosion would rip through the treetops, shattering branches and turning them into thousands of wooden projectiles. These wood splinters, some of them several feet long, flew through the air at deadly speeds. All the traditional methods of fighting in a forest, like taking cover behind trees or in foxholes, were now useless because the attack came from above. American artillery crews quickly learned how to use this effect. A single 155mm proximity fused shell exploding over the forest could kill everything in an area the size of a tennis court. The combination of steel fragments and wood splinters created a kill zone that was impossible to survive. German soldiers who were experts in forest warfare found that their skills meant nothing. If they spread out, they were vulnerable to the wide blast area. But if they bunched together for protection, a single shell could wipe out an entire squad. There was simply no right way to defend against this new weapon. The technology behind the proximity fuse was like something out of science fiction for the time. Each fuse had a small radio that sent out waves. When these waves bounced off an object like the ground or a vehicle, they were reflected back. As the shell got closer to the ground, the reflected signal got stronger. When it reached a specific strength, which corresponded to the ideal height, a switch would trigger the explosion. This whole system had to work under unbelievable stress. When fired, the fuse experienced forces of 20,000 times Earth's gravity. The shell spun at incredible speeds, and temperatures swung from thousands of degrees in the cannon barrel to freezing cold high in the air. But the tiny vacuum tubes, protected by special cushioning, still worked with more than 80% reliability. Engineers had figured out the perfect explosion height for each type of cannon through extensive testing. For the common 105mm howitzer, 30 feet was ideal. For the larger 155mm guns, it was 50 feet. The massive 240mm shells could clear entire map grid squares when they detonated over 70 feet in the air. This technological advantage gave American forces battlefield dominance. Studies later showed that proximity fuses were 5 to 10 times more effective than conventional shells. They were even more deadly against aircraft. As they increased the success rate of shooting down German V-1 flying bombs from 17% to 79% almost overnight, Germany's failure to understand this new technology was a massive intelligence blunder. In December 1944, German troops captured an American supply depot and found about 20,000 proximity-fused shells. This should have been a huge discovery. But when German engineers examined the fuses, they declared that such a device was impossible. They could not believe that vacuum tubes could survive being fired from a cannon. So they concluded it must be some kind of trick or decoy. This was a case of institutional blindness. Germany had actually been a leader in proximity fuse research before the war. But in 1940, Hitler had cancelled all weapons projects that would take longer than 6 months to complete, and the fuse program was shut down. Therefore, German engineers simply could not accept that the Americans had solved a problem that they themselves had given up on. The irony is that German scientists had been working on a different type of proximity fuse that was 95% reliable in tests. Had they continued their work? They might have had their own version by 1941. Christmas Day of 1944 offered no peace. German units that tried to use the holiday to regroup and get new supplies found that proximity fuses did not observe ceasefires. Field kitchens, supply trucks, and assembly points were hit by devastating artillery that did not need observers on the ground to be accurate. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day alone. Most with proximity fuses. Their ability to fire accurately in bad weather and at night turned artillery into a constant 24-hour threat. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers had always used bad weather as a time to move safely, knowing that Allied planes could not fly. But proximity fuses took away that sanctuary. Death could now come from the sky at any time, in any weather, with no warning. On December 21st, an elite unit of German commandos led by SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny tried to capture the town of Malmedy. These were some of Germany's best soldiers, famous for daring operations and even infiltrating American lines in uniforms. But as they attacked, they were met with a storm of proximity-fused artillery. The shells exploded above them with chilling accuracy, turning their disguises into death traps. The attack failed completely, with very heavy losses. The effect on these elite SS troops was particularly noteworthy. These men had been trained to believe in their own superiority, but they found themselves completely powerless against American technology. Reports from the battle describe some survivors simply charging at the American lines, choosing a quick death over the unending, terrifying bombardment. This was a total collapse of discipline among some of Hitler's most loyal soldiers. The production of the proximity fuse was an industrial miracle. By December 1944, over 100 American companies were involved in making them. The Crosley Corporation stopped making refrigerators and started assembling fuses. Emerson Radio switched from home electronics to weapons manufacturing. Companies like Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric dedicated entire factories to the project. Quality control was stricter than anything seen before in mass production. Every single one of the 130 components was tested individually. Every soldered connection was inspected with a magnifying glass to ensure they worked. Random fuses were taken from the production line and actually fired. The workforce, which was made up mostly of women, maintained this incredible level of precision while working long, demanding shifts. Because of the intense secrecy, they did not even know what they were making, only that it was crucial for winning the war. By the end of 1944, a new proximity fuse was coming off the assembly line every 2 seconds. The efficiency of production was also incredible. In 1942, a single fuse cost $732, which was more than many workers made in a year. But by the end of the war, mass production had brought the cost down to just $18 per fuse. This allowed for the production of 22 million fuses during the war, with 200,000 of them being used in the Battle of the Bulge alone. General Patton was one of the commanders who best understood the value of the proximity fuse. His Third Army used them as a key weapon in their drive to rescue the soldiers at Bastogne. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, created new tactics just for these shells. He developed a technique called time on target, where multiple artillery battalions would coordinate their fire so all their shells landed at the exact same moment. When dozens of proximity-fused shells exploded at the same time, the effect was devastating. German soldiers called it the bell toll of death. In the last week of December, Patton's army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells, which was a decisive factor in breaking the German resistance. The battle for Elsenborn Ridge was a perfect example of the proximity fuse's defensive power. 2 American infantry divisions held this vital high ground against attacks from Germany's elite 6th SS Panzer Army. Over 3 days, from December 17th to 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 shells, and about 40,000 of them had proximity fuses. While these fused shells were only a quarter of the total fired, they are estimated to have caused 60% of the more than 5,000 German casualties. The German attacks up the steep. Wooded slopes were met with walls of air-bursting steel. Entire companies were destroyed in seconds. The attacks finally stopped after 3 days because the elite Waffen-SS had been broken by American technology. On New Year's Day, 1945, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack on Allied airfields with 900 fighter planes. They destroyed many Allied planes on the ground. But as the German pilots flew back to their bases, they were met with a wall of anti-aircraft fire using proximity fuses. Of the 277 German planes lost that day, 172 were shot down by anti-aircraft guns. German pilots who were trained to dodge predictable anti-aircraft fire found that these new shells exploded exactly where they were most vulnerable. The Luftwaffe never recovered from these losses. By early January 1945, the secret of the proximity fuse was out. Too many had been used, and too many soldiers on both sides had seen what they could do. On January 6th, the War Department allowed the story to be partially released. German intelligence finally understood what they were facing. But it was too late. A German report from January 10th stated that the Americans had a radio-controlled fuse and that there was no way to counter it. After the war, analysis confirmed the massive impact of the proximity fuse. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt said that the fuse was decisive in their defeat, stating that his attacks failed because of American artillery that seemed to have eyes. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a German panzer commander, testified that the American artillery, especially the new air-bursting shells, caused panic even among his most experienced troops. The numbers speak for themselves. The 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired during the battle are estimated to have caused between 15,000 and 20,000 German casualties. The weapon was 5 to 10 times more effective than standard ammunition and could be used in any weather, day or night. Behind these numbers is a story of human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them just teenagers, died in ways they could not have imagined. They were killed by a weapon that seemed to be intelligent, that could find them no matter where they tried to hide. The American workers who built these fuses also paid a price. They worked under immense stress and in total secrecy, producing a weapon of incredible lethality without ever knowing what it was. But the morality of war is complex. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without the proximity fuse, that number would certainly have been higher, and the war would have lasted longer. Every day the war was shortened meant thousands of lives were saved in the concentration camps that were awaiting liberation. The proximity fuse project led to technological breakthroughs that shaped the post-war world. The tiny vacuum tubes became the basis for modern electronics. The quality control methods used in the factories became the standard for all industries. The way hundreds of companies were organized to work together pioneered modern supply chain management. The science behind the fuse's radar evolved into the systems we use today, and the concept of a weapon that could sense its environment and make a decision became the foundation for all modern smart weapons. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25th. Chapter 40. Hitler's last great offensive had failed, costing Germany around 100,000 casualties and gaining nothing. The proximity fuse had proven to be a war-winning weapon. General Eisenhower himself believed that if the Germans had possessed this technology, the D-Day landings might have been impossible. It was not just a better artillery shell. It was a revolutionary piece of technology that changed the rules of war. The German soldiers in the Ardennes faced something entirely new: death from a shell that seemed to think for itself, turning the very air around them into a weapon. Their experience marked the moment warfare fully entered the technological age. From Colonel Axelson's single, unauthorized decision to the deployment of 200,000 shells. The proximity fuse proved that scientific innovation could provide the ultimate advantage in war. The story of the proximity fuse is about transformation. It showed that an industrial democracy could create weapons of incredible power, and that innovation could overcome a numerical disadvantage. These lessons did not just shape the rest of World War II. They shaped the future of all warfare. In the cold forests of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare had truly begun. The mathematics of death had been rewritten by tiny radars inside artillery shells, forever changing the way wars are fought.